Effects project, you have compositions, and within the composition settings is an area where you can specify a renderer. A renderer is the part of After Effects that analyzes the data contained within a composition and determines how the scene should look. Things like the shininess of a layer, or can a layer even have shininess? Can the layer exist in 3D space? If it does exist in 3D space, can it have 3D depth? Different renderers give you different options. And in this tutorial, I'll show you how to switch between renderers in After Effects. Start by going to the project panel and double-clicking on the 01 Naturalist's 2D composition. This should look pretty familiar because it's a bunch of Illustrator layers on top of an orange solid. Select layer 1 and press P to open the position, and you'll notice it has X position and Y position, which means it exists in 2D space. In order to create 3D space in After Effects, all you have to do is enable 3D for a layer. So go to the right side of the switches column here and click in this box to enable 3D for that layer. Once I've enabled 3D, now I have X, Y, and Z for the position of this layer. Now if we go down, you'll notice I have material options. Open the material options and you can see there are several different options. Light transmission, diffusion, specular intensity. Don't worry, if you're not familiar with these terms, it's easy enough to figure out once you start scrubbing with the different parameters. The important thing to understand is there are material options, and that determines how the material will appear within this renderer. So collapse the material options, and then you'll notice the geometry options are grayed out. If you look to the right of the geometry options, click on the text Change Renderer. That will automatically open your composition settings directly to the 3D renderer area. By default, After Effects is in the classic 3D renderer. This will allow you to position layers in 3D space, but they will remain 2D layers. Click on the dropdown and choose Cinema 4D. Immediately, you'll see a list of features that are enabled, like the ability to extrude and bevel text and shapes. And then there are features that are disabled, like blend modes and track mats. If we wanted to change this composition to the Cinema 4D renderer, all we'd have to do is go down and press OK. So go ahead and press OK. Once we do that, now we get access to geometry options. And if I open the geometry options, since this is an Illustrator layer, I have the ability to curve that layer. Now I've already set up some compositions with the different renderers, so you can get a general idea as to how the objects would appear within those renderers. Go back to the project panel and double-click on the 02 Naturalist's Classic 3D composition. In this comp, you'll notice I have 3 different lights, I have a camera, and I have a bunch of layers that exist in 3D space. Select the camera layer, layer 4, and press P on your keyboard to open the position. Scrub on the X parameter of the camera to see the depth of the scene. While these layers are flat, they exist in different planes in Z depth, so we get the perception of actual 3D. Go back to the project panel and double-click on the 03 composition, and notice this one actually contains an element that has true 3D depth. If we look in the timeline, go to layer 4, and you can see we have a shape layer, and this shape layer was created by converting this Illustrator layer. So I'll select layer 4 and press R to open the rotation and orientation settings. If you click and drag on the Y rotation, you can see this object is a true 3-dimensional object, and that's only available within the Cinema 4D renderer. When you're in the Cinema 4D renderer, if you go to the upper right corner of the composition panel, you'll see a button that says Cinema 4D. Go ahead and click on that, and you notice this button will take you to the composition settings in the 3D renderer area as well. So you could change the composition back to a different renderer. Just understand, if you want true 3D depth in your objects, you need to be using the Cinema 4D renderer. Whenever you're working with a 2D layer in After Effects, there is the possibility of enabling 3D just on that layer. And then when you do that, you'll get access to a host of new controls. So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you not only how to enable 3D for 2D layers, but how to maintain control over those layers once they're in 3D space. To start, let's go to the timeline and select layer 1. Press P on your keyboard to open the position data, and you see it has X and Y for the parameters, meaning it exists in 2D space. Make sure your switches panel is active. If not, toggle between your switches and modes to your switches, and make sure that 3D is enabled over here on the right side of layer 1. Once you enable 3D, you should notice that we now have X, Y, and Z. We also have orientation in addition to rotation, and we have material options. Now let's go to the composition panel. Press the period key on your keyboard to zoom in, not once but twice, till you get to 200%. It's kind of hard to see, but there are control handles here. So if I hover over this green control handle, when I get over that main point, you'll see the letter Y, meaning I will move this along the Y axis. So click and drag on the green handle to move this layer only along the y-axis. Press W on your keyboard to access the rotation tool and hover back over the same exact axis. Once you see the letter Y, click and drag, and now we're rotating that 2D layer in 3D space on the y-axis. The same goes for the x-axis and the z-axis. Now I'll just press Ctrl-Z on Windows or Command-Z on the Mac to undo, and press V on my keyboard to grab the selection tool. Hover over any of the parameters and click and drag to scrub that parameter. As you're dragging, if you hold Shift down, it will scrub 10 times as fast. I'll press Ctrl-Z on Windows or Command-Z on the Mac to undo. Once you've enabled 3D on a layer, it's always wise to look in the upper right corner of the composition panel. This is where After Effects will tell you which renderer you're currently working in. If you decided you were in the wrong renderer, you can always just click on this button to go to your composition settings and change renderers. Now, whenever I'm enabling and positioning 2D layers in 3D space, I have to tell you I scrub the parameters in the timeline more often than not. Because if your composition has a lot of layers involved, sometimes it's hard to make sure that you can click directly on one of these tiny little points when you're repositioning an object. I find sometimes it's much easier just to scrub on the parameters in the timeline. 3D on a layer is the first step in trying to create a little more depth in your project. But the second step is actually adding lights into the project. Go to the timeline and you'll notice all of the layers currently exist in 3D space. Start at the bottom, click and drag up over the layers to select them all, and press P to open the position data. I like to pay attention to where the layers exist in Z space, especially when I'm looking straight on, because I really don't have much of a sense of perspective right now. The top two layers are closer to us by 100 pixels. So press P again to hide the position data, and click at the bottom of the timeline to deselect all those layers. Let's add a light to the scene to create more perspective. Go up under the Layer menu and choose New, Light. There are 4 different kinds of lights inside of After Effects, so click on the Light type dropdown, and let's start with the parallel light. I'll give you a quick rundown of each of the different lights. A parallel light is an excellent light if you want to cast an even light, but have a direction set behind it. It doesn't spread out like light coming from a light bulb. It's more of an even directional light, similar to light from the sun. Click on the dropdown and choose Spotlight. This behaves very much like a typical stage light, where you can control the angle of the cone of light and the softness of the feather. There is fall off on this light, and you can cast shadows. Now, your light settings might be different than mine. That's perfectly fine. Lights have a tendency to remember whatever the previous settings were used the last time that light was created. Go back up under the Light type dropdown and choose Point Light. Point Light has no cone angle or feather, but I can adjust the intensity. It throws light in all directions, very much like a light bulb without a lampshade. Let me explain fall off for a quick second. Click on the dropdown for fall off, and you could choose none if you didn't want the light to have fall off. 9 times out of 10, I choose smooth because it renders the fastest. If you want realistic shadows, choose inverse square clamped. Let me explain smooth. With smooth selected, the radius of 500 means the light at 100% intensity is going to go out 500 pixels. And then it's going to start falling off in intensity for another 500 pixels until it gets to an intensity of 0. Okay, go back up under Light type, and let's choose the ambient light. This is a great way to just add overall brightness to a scene, or if you choose a negative value, you can darken a scene. Now click on the dropdown and let's choose Spotlight. I'll leave the color set to white, and I'll leave all these other settings the same. Intensity 100, cone angle 90, cone feather 50, fall off smooth, radius 500, fall off distance 500. I enabled cast shadows, and I set my shadows to 75% darkness with a diffusion of 10 pixels. When I click OK, the light's been added to the scene, and it's kind of hard to see what's going on. In the timeline, since the light is selected, we can just press T to open the intensity settings for that light. Click and drag to the right to increase the intensity of that light. If you press AA rather quickly, you'll get all the light options. To try and soften up the edges of this light, let's click on the cone angle and scrub and see if that makes much of a difference. And it really doesn't. I have a sneaking suspicion the issue is the fall off radius. So I'm going to go down to the radius setting for the fall off and click and drag to increase the radius of the fall off. And sure enough, the light wasn't getting far enough to actually reach our background. Let's go ahead and crank up the radius to 1160. Now we can also increase the cone angle to a value of about 141. So I have a radius of 1160, cone angle of 141, and I'll bring the intensity back down to a normal level around 112. Maybe not that little. Let's do 125. There we go. Now we have a really nice highlight on this area. In order to fill in the edges, let's add another light. I'll go up to the Layer menu and choose New, Light, and this time, instead of a spotlight, let's click on the drop-down and just add an ambient light. We'll bring the intensity for that ambient light down to around 42 and click OK, and that should definitely brighten up the scene there a little bit. Now that the background's under control, let's see if we can add more dimension by having the logo and the word cast a shadow. Collapse Layer 2 and select both Layers 3 and 4. Click on one, hold down Shift, and click on the other. Press AA rather quickly on your keyboard to open the material options. Then enable Cast Shadows. Select Layer 2 and press P to open the position. And let's scrub on the X parameter and bring it over to the side just a little bit so the shadow kind of pops off the side. Now the logo's definitely popping off the background. And remember, if you want to adjust how light interacts in a scene, it's a balancing act between the light settings and the material options of the layers that the light is illuminating.